He'll probably ask me to chair it, so see what we had. Easton was a former House member, and I was a former House member, 2 retired judges.
Thanks for your help.
Things here going on. One is Scott and I talked about this, and this is going to take the place of another major project for him. We had assigned a project, and he and I talked, and I said, why don't we do this instead? So I thought it would be fascinating, and I wanted to meet you because of AL's speaking so highly of you. What we'd like to do is, one is for a school project, but we'd also like the opportunity to perhaps, with your permission, and we get back to you with that, is for Scott and I to publish results of this interview. Does that make you uncomfortable?
I'm dead meat, man.
No,
long gone.
No, you're part of your.
Well, let's see how we get along. It's not false modesty, but I just like to stay over the crowd.
But would you not want us to do that?
I'll have to think about that one.
Okay. Well, what we would do is send it back to you and say, is this acceptable?
It can't be interesting anymore.
Oh,
good Lord, man.
You are.
What's the matter with him, Scott?
You are an integral part of Virginia's contemporary history. And that's a shame. It's like you look at an island, you only see a little peak. It's just like looking at today. That island didn't get there without the foundation below it. To understand the island, you really need to understand what the foundation was.
Yeah, so you also know some of the islands in Chesapeake Bay are disappearing. Some have and some are doing it. Keep that in mind.
Well, because my voice is so bad, I think Scott's going to ask the questions and I'll just take some notes.
Scott, you're a radio man too, aren't you?
Yeah. I came up with some of these questions, and Dr. Colvin helped me rearrange some. So here goes.
Shoot.
Mr. Cooke, it has been 20 years since you stepped down from being what many across the Commonwealth call a powerhouse in Virginia politics. What made you a powerhouse?
Scott, in the beginning, I think that is a wrong term to apply to me.
I've seen it applied to you so many times in various articles.
I would not consider myself a powerhouse at any time in my life, Scott.
What was your greatest accomplishment while serving?
I expect it was more than one undertaking, but a combination of undertakings, the modernization of the General Assembly. In the early 1970s, the Ford Foundation made some ranking back in the 1960s, as a matter of fact, made some ranking of the 50 states legislative, those are, of course, legislative bodies. Virginia was ranked 34th among the 50. Certainly was not a very enviable rank to hold. And at that time we formed, and other states were doing it also, trying to pull themselves into the 20th century. It was time to get into the 20th century by then, the century getting to its end. And formed what was called the Legislative Process Commission. That undertook to, as the term indicates, look at the whole process of how legislation was enacted, what accompanying mechanics we had to enact legislation, what sort of assistance we had, and each member. And we came after several years' study. I had the honor of being chairman of that commission, and Fred Pollard, who was then the presiding officer, Lieutenant Governor, presiding officer of the Senate, vice chairman, we worked very closely. And several members of the commission, who would notably would include Lewis McMurray of Newport News, and Jim Thompson, the floor leader of the House from Alexandria, Otto Andrews from the Senate, Joe Garland from the Senate, and others, there were probably 8 or 10 of us on the commission. And we came forth with some rather, I thought, good recommendations for the improvement of the legislative process, including a recommendation, a strong recommendation for annual sessions of the General Assembly. Ever since Constitution 1902 had been in effect, we had what we called a biannual General Assembly, which met every 2 years, subject to special sessions whenever required. We felt that that was almost an archaic provision. Incidentally, back when the 1902 Constitution was formed, I understand some of the leading newspapers in the state, for some reason or other, maybe the leading business people had recommended the General Assembly meet only once every 4 years. Maybe they felt that too much mischief was being called on by frequent meetings. Nonetheless, we felt that Virginia, being such a large state and having as many problems as large states do, that it should meet annually. And just prior to that, a commission on state government headed by former Governor Albertus Harrison had taken up the same subject, but had recommended that the biannual session be continued, but extended to 90 days rather than the conventional 60 days. And we just did not accept that concept. Some of us wanted to have 60-day sessions. It appeared that that was not going to be possible, but we took that 30 days that the other commission a few years before had recommended, took those 30 days off those 90 days, and set this odd number of years as we have now. Both the 60 and 30-day sessions are subject to extensions for 30 days. I hope that Virginia, sometime in the not too distant future, and it should be done right now, will go to at least 90-day session.
I saw that. Did you write that editorial in the paper regarding?
Well, I may have, though, because I've written some on the subject. And, Virginia is a very large state. When I first went to General Assembly, there were 2.5 million people. What is it now? Pretty near 7 million, 6+ million. More people you have, more problems arise. It's a natural fact of life. At any rate, I believe that recommending annual sessions was the most important item taken care of by our commission. Unfortunately, the state constitution was just being overhauled at that time, so it gave us an opportunity to put that in there. And it passed. There was some opposition to it, but it passed both houses at 2 required sessions of the Constitution, and we've had the annual session ever since. My argument at the time was that practically all of us who had been there any length of time had been coming to annual sessions, was special session was called. And I remember when I got out after 38 years of service in the General Assembly, I'd been to 36 sessions, which almost was equivalent of annual sessions. Some papers at the time thought we were making a mistake. I don't think we have. 90-day session, as you gentlemen I think we'll agree, is absolutely needed now because of the huge volume of bills. There are many more coming in every session now.
How can they actually comprehend all of those bills?
It's impossible, Scott. It cannot be done. A 90-day session, I think, would be feasible with the provision, some way or other, to have some cut-off dates in it. It's just a natural tendency of any legislative body to put off at the last minute. You see Congress every year putting off the important matters to the end. And I do believe that some strong resolutions would have to be introduced at each session and adhered to have certain cut-off dates during those 90 days. But in my judgment, a 90-day session is essential. Now to get back to other things that our Legislative Process Commission recommended was more staffing. Certainly the 40 members of the Senate and the 100 members of the House needed staffing assistance. That's growing. I understand it's gotten much larger than when I was there. We recommended the building of an state office building. We didn't get a new building, but we took over the Life Insurance Company of Virginia, the General Assembly building. Each member has an office now. Prior to that time, we just had our desk in the chamber. That was the office. Serviced by, perhaps, I don't know what the Senate, how many stenographers they had in the Senate. I think we had either 10 or 12 in the Senate. It was chaos there, really, in this 60-day session, trying to maintain an office and try to take care of bills on the floor and so forth. So I think that, to recap, summarize, the annual session recommendation and the staffing, adequate staffing for members, providing office space for the members were the most important things that we did, and I took from that as a highlight of my career.
Tell me about your relationships with the governors you served with. Does any one stand out?
You're getting on rather tricky ground there. Yeah, some do and some don't. So far as my relationship is concerned, it was much better as on the floor than the speaker. Well, the speaker and I told Vance Rivers when he came down here before the session we had, he wanted to talk with him. And I've told speakers before that time that the governor's office just beats down on the speaker. It was true or false, and I doubt that this is the case. They sort of look for the speaker as what person in the House they could talk to try to get the legislation through. And quite often, the governor's recommendation did not square exactly with my own view. So in the earlier days, when I didn't have the responsibility of the speakership, I think I got my relationship with the governors was better than later on. We got along in friendly fashion, but of course every governor had his agenda. He wanted to get his program through, whatever it was, and most of the times I could be helpful, but sometimes I could not, and I had to tell them that. And then I'd start getting all sorts of messages. So I'm not going to try to publicly rate what I thought of the governors. All of them were good men. I think they had the welfare of Virginia at heart, but some obviously made a larger contribution than others did.
How was the Virginia Democratic Party changed?
I don't know. I don't know what has changed, but it's such an obvious radical departure from the Democratic Party I grew up in. I don't know. It's called by the opposition party. It's called a liberal group of people. I don't subscribe to that at all. I think most of the Democrats I know and most of the Republicans I know are moderate persuasion. But I think it is considered, certainly by the media anyway, news media, as a liberal group of people. I don't think so. I've always styled myself as a moderate conservative. I think that's a large percentage of Virginians that fall into that category.
If you could go back, would you have done anything differently as a delegate and as a speaker?
I suppose so, but I can't think of them now. I'm sure I'm pretty good at second guessing and so forth what others do, and second guessing what I do sometimes. And I've had thoughts on things. And, to pick out any single one now, I can't do it. But you're correct. Your question is very pertinent, because I sure think we would have done some things differently.
Deep down, do you regret not running for governor?
Oh, no.
Why not?
Well, it's a question that you see arising almost in any campaign now, the question of money. Scott, I wasn't going across Virginia and asking friends and people, acquaintances and people I didn't know, the money to finance a campaign. I had no idea doing that. I had some very, very pleasant offers of support, which I greatly appreciated. But I don't. I just could not see myself in a statewide race. I had enough statewide government as speaker.
Would something have turned you off by competing in a statewide race? The negativity of the campaigns is...
Well, fortunately, I had only a few campaigns for election to the House of Delegates during those 38 years. But when I did have them, I certainly could not talk about my opponent in a negative fashion. I wouldn't do it. And, I think it's terrible. It's terrible. If you can't win on your own merits, you got no business running.
Why were you enticed by public life? Was it just serendipity? Or had you been thinking about it, looking around Virginia and saying, heck, I can do it as well, if not better?
No, you're certainly wrong in your last conclusion there. I think anyone could have done it better than I. I worked in the county clerk's office as a youngster, in my young 20s. Which I made me thrown with Colvin to some extent. Gloucester and Mathews counties were combined as a house district for a great many years. It's very ancient. Some changes were made in that century before. Sometimes it was Mathews, Middlesex. We'll find Gloucester alone, but for a great many years, Gloucester and Mathews had been a separate house district. Back in the 20s and 30s, sometimes there was a deviation from it, but most of the time the people that ran the courthouse, the county officers and the political leaders, chose a candidate for the House of Delegates or the Senate, as the case may be. And there was some, of course, unwritten understanding between Gloucester and Mathews that the Gloucester delegate would serve 2 terms, or the Mathews delegate to have a chance at 2 terms and so forth. And they usually were elected. Sometimes it didn't happen. And Jimmy Martin, who was member for 4 years before I got in, was Gloucester, very fine young Gloucester lawyer. He said he was through with it. But political leaders over here came to Mathews to talk to me to see if I wanted to run. I was 26 years old at the time, for all things. And it sounded attractive, so I got in there. I had opposition to primary from Gloucester, but I won and stayed there for 38 years.
What was the most troubling experience?
That's a real easy question to answer. You mean in
your legislative?
After the Supreme Court decision in 1954. Segregation, integration issue became, because I sort of smile now when I hear the members on the floor on this occasion. They talk about the tough times they have with funding the various functions of government and taxation and education and whatever. And I always tell them you should have been there in the 50s and 60s. But that was a very traumatic experience. Virginia, along with the rest of the South, was undergoing a change. It had to undergo a change. There's no question about it. The Supreme Court had spoken. And we went through all sorts of posturing devices to maintain integration and maintain segregation in schools. Went on for several years, 1954 to 1959, and then the ultimate vote came down, and those of us who had supported various segregation continuing measures felt that it was time to make a change. Governor Allman was the chief executive at that time. He had, all during the same period as governor and before that as attorney general, had taken the same stance that the majority of the General Assembly had, that segregation had to be maintained somewhere. The private schools was running up here. Yeah, the Seg Academies, as they were later called. Support was given to them in some small degree, financial support. And there were certain areas of the state that are adamant is maybe a mild word to use, but adamant that there would be no integration of public schools in those certain areas. But finally, in 1959, the question came down: is there going to be public education in Virginia, or isn't there? I voted to keep schools open. Didn't receive too much criticism, some from this area, but not overwhelming criticism like some others did. The bill passed the House narrowly and barely got through the Senate, but that was the ultimate test in my estimation as to whether Virginia was going to continue to pursue a supposedly integrated course. The question arose again mildly in 1970 over the busing issue, but had nowhere near the volume of rebellion that we had in the 1950s and early 60s. That, in my mind, was the most important thing that happened.
What do you think of Jim Gilmore's performance as governor?
I don't know Mr. Gilmore. I never have met him, and I reckon it's better to assess a man's performance after he gets out of office than it is now.
Okay. How about George Allen, his predecessor?
I knew him slightly. I expect Virginia certainly survived his administration. It was good so far as I know.
Give me your appraisal of this last General Assembly session under Republican control.
It went along smoothly. The state is still living. There's no. I think it's to the credit of both parties that they continued the Virginia way of good manners.
What do
I don't know any way to express it.
What do you see as the most pressing issue for the state of Virginia in the next decade?
I don't know. I think that you go talk to someone that's more abreast of current affairs than I am. There are so many elements of government that have to be attended to. As the population grows, the questions of have to be considered that we didn't even think about maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But, people demand more services. Those services have to be provided. I expect, so far as money is concerned, public education is probably the most notable problem that will have to be taken care of, but it's been an abiding problem since the beginning of public education in the 19th century. And start 1870. It didn't start with much favor among the people. Certainly everybody has read about the difficulties that each locality had in raising money for public schools. It's still something that requires attention all the time. I reckon public education could be the largest, but I have to beg off a real answer to that question.
How do you think history will regard you, and how do you hope it will regard you?
Well, I have grave doubts in history that I'm going to make much of a note in history, Scott. I hope people look.
As far as your legislative career is concerned,
I hope they'll look upon it kindly.
Which legislators stand out in your mind as examples for others to follow?
Well, again, that's like you asked me about rating the governors. I'm hesitant, but some of them have been outstanding people. great privilege for me to have been associated. Go back to the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. Along there were a number of outstanding men and women. Some of the women have contributed very much to the advancement of good legislation.
What are the qualities needed to be an effective speaker?
I don't know if I've considered that question. I think presiding officer has to be fair at all times. And if he loses that sense of fairness, he's going to lose the support of the legislative body. I think fairness is the number one criterion.
Do you have any advice for the Virginia Republican Party?
No, I think that they've got people in there that are quite capable of managing the party. I told Speaker Wilkins that I'd be glad to help him at any time, any question arose, but I've told other speakers the same thing. They can always call on me for whatever poor advice I can give, but I'll be glad to give it. But I have no specific advice to give them.
What is the difference between being a Virginia Democrat and a Virginia Republican?
I would say there's hardly any anymore. At one time, it was a terrific divide after the Civil War ended, and during the period of Reconstruction, Republicans were, I think, considered almost a different breed of Virginians. Today, I don't see any particular difference between them.
What advice would you have for a young person wishing to pursue public service in the political arena today?
I think they should study before they get in. But I hope young people, and I'd like to see more young people get in. But so far as the pecuniary advantage, they can't do it. I reckon it's expensive. In public life, whatever office you might hold is going to entail some expense. I think very few people get wealthy from public service, but I would like to see more young people embrace it as a career.
Tell me a little bit about your parents. Now, you were born when your father was 79, is that right?
76.
76, and your father was in General Robert E. Lee's?
He was in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was on staff of General Lee. Lived to be the last survivor of that 12-member staff, big 12-member.
Dr. Colvin, do you have anything that...
Well, just a couple of things. As Virginia moved from 2.5 to 6.5 million people in 25 years, if it moves to 13 million, do you see a day when a full-time legislature would be a good idea for Virginia?
I would think not. We sort of pride ourselves on being citizen legislators, and the full-time ones, well, where do you have them? Pennsylvania, California, New York. They are, of course, very, very large states, and they may be necessary. I don't think Virginia's population, say in the next half century, is going to require anything like that, but there's no question now that more, as I said earlier in this interview, that there's no question now that more time is needed, and this 60-day session is just ridiculous with the problems that come up.
I saw where the General Assembly this session ended a day early. What do you think of that? I mean, were they trying to make a point, or?
I think it has a cosmetic effect too. I hope it didn't rush to a too hasty conclusion, but I don't know. I wasn't there, Scott. You're going to have to ask something there.
Mr. Cooke, during the 40s when you were first there, how many bills would the General Assembly deal with in a year?
Probably 600 to 700 per session.
And this last session was 3,000.
So 30-some hundred, yes. And that's typical of the sessions now.
Is that too many bills?
No, I don't think so. Those members represent people. They represent local governments. They represent regional governments, and it sounds sort of silly, but sometimes just a bill is needed to change language, make a bigger correction of language. And some of them are very innocuous. Some of them have some far-reaching effect. But each one counts as a bill and has to be considered. You may recall that didn't we have a constitutional amendment to vote on to limit the number of bills? My memory's not clear on that, but
I think
it was
it
defeated.
seems like to me that came up at one time. I do remember something about that.
There's been a lot of discussion about limiting it.
It was a constitutional amendment, and I really forget its contents now, but it had something to do with limitation of introduction of legislation, and the people of Virginia defeated it. Because each member has his own problem there, and if he is requested or feels the need to introduce a bill on any subject, I think he should have the right to do it. He or she.
Mr. Cooke, does Virginia need to change to allow a two-term governor?
It may. I've always opposed it. I like the present system. I can't get away from the fact that if you had two terms, and suddenly the first term would be spent in campaigning for the second term, or making points for your second election anyway. Virginia gets along very well under the present system.
You hear a lot of people sometimes say that government is wasteful and inefficient. What has your experience been with government in those regards?
It is correct to a degree that it is wasteful, but again, you can equate it with big business. The larger you get, there's more possibility for waste. It's a concomitant of a number of people.
Final question I have is, what important question did we not ask you?
Doctor, I think you covered all of them. I wish I could have given more clear and coherent answers to some. Scott stopped me with 2 or 3 of them.
I'm just curious, the people that are serving in the General Assembly today, are there any that are still serving that were serving with you?
A few, yes. Well, Wilkins came.
Did he serve with you?
Speaker. His first term was my last. He came in '78. He was Lacey Putney.
Alan Diamondstein?
Alan Diamondstein. Alan was pretty senior member. Alan came up in 1968. Fitz Callahan. Probably Jim Dillon. Probably a dozen left from that time.
Okay, do you have anything else?